super excited for the topic today. So we got Avi Mish coming back on for a second time, and what we're going to talk about, he's did a couple very notable things. I happen to be a big fan of his content on LinkedIn that you post. But Avi is a senior enterprise account executive at Orem. So last year in 2022, he had 162% of target. You were coming off a good Q2 last time that we talked. And when we were preparing for this, one of the things that Avi had shared was, I mean, I don't want to say unorthodox, but there's some things that you're doing that work pretty well that are maybe not taught to a lot of reps, sort of counterintuitive. That's the word that I was looking for that we're going to get into today. So let us know in the chat if you haven't. Say hi. Let us know where you're coming in from. But Avi, it's good to have you on another webinar, man.
Yeah, good to be here. Appreciate the invite.
So what I figured would be good to do, just for everyone here, again, say hi in the chat if you haven't yet. If you got a question as we come up, drop it into the Q&A. But some of the things that we're going to talk about are when to talk about budget and deal cycles, how to identify early red flags and DQ deals. We're going to talk about champion building, multi-threading, how to deploy your internal resources. And we talked about some fun stuff prior to hitting record as well, around like kind of the other stuff outside of sales. So how to decompress, stay balanced, that kind of thing. So let us know if you got any questions in the Q&A button. I thought Avi would be good first. Let's start with like your background in terms of how you got into sales. When do you feel like you had an aha moment where you're like, yeah, this whole sales thing, I feel like I'm starting to actually figure out what this is?
It took a long time. I was probably in sales for like 3 or 4 years before I felt like I was actually had any idea what I was doing. I think for me, the aha moment was the command of the message training that I got from Force Management when I was at Sisense. Just really thinking about it, like the before scenarios and after scenarios that you can expect from any kind of investment, and tying those to like the negative consequences of sticking with the status quo. It really simplified things for me in a way that it just wasn't like that for me before.
Yeah. Is there, like, I think that what's pretty tough in B2B sales, I started in B2C. So my first job was going door to door selling house painting services, right? And when you're selling house painting services, you're dealing with a husband and a wife typically. Is who you're selling to. Like, you get to interact with everyone that's going to be in charge of the purchasing decision. In B2B, I think what's kind of hard is that, correct me if I'm wrong, you probably haven't done the job necessarily of the people that you're selling to in most cases, and been a part of like buying decisions internally at an org. So it's kind of this thing where you're selling to these people that go through this process on their end that you haven't experienced firsthand yourself. Was that a big part of it with the command of message, where it's like, oh, I'm kind of seeing like what actually creates change within an organization and what spurs people to like get out of their status quo? If that question makes sense.
Yeah, I think the real thing for command of the message that resonated with me was the ability to articulate the business value that I was delivering. Like my first job, I was selling call tracking technology to car dealerships. Like my first post-college job, I've never worked in a car dealership, so I didn't really know what was involved with selling cars, and was really just relying on the enablement that I got from the company on the persona and the business value that we were going to deliver. Same thing at Sisense. We were selling primarily to technical buyers and product leaders whose jobs I didn't have either. And so really for me was all about understanding the business value that I'm delivering for their company as a whole. That was the light that just went off for me.
Yeah, the business value. It's so much more than, and maybe you can elaborate on this a little bit more, because I think we talk about ROI and we throw that term around a lot. When you say business value, you want to talk a little bit more about like what you mean by that?
Well, I think it's so at Orem, for example, right? So we're a live conversation platform. We're helping people get into more conversations with their prospects. And so at its most foundational level, what we're helping people do is make more calls in a lot less time. But an executive doesn't care about that. And if I focus on that as I'm articulating the value that Orem provides, I'm not going to win over a CFO or a CRO. Instead, what they care about is, they're missing their pipeline targets, or their, ACV has shrunk and their, sales cycles are lengthening. And so they need to increase pipe gen to hit their revenue targets. So I think it's really just thinking about the executive level business value versus the low level impact you've got on maybe an individual contributor or frontline manager.
Yeah. So I want to dig into this. This would be kind of the first area that we spend a little bit of time. Let me know in the chat. What do you sell? Let us know in the chat. We'd love to kind of customize the content a little bit. And as that's coming in, what I heard from you there is like really figuring out there's this whole above the line and below the line type of selling Skip Miller talks about a lot, right? How do we get someone like a sales rep or a sales manager in your case excited about Orem because it's going to increase call volume, you're going to set more meetings, and you're going to do it in a less amount of time, versus, okay, CRO doesn't even probably know, at a large company especially, what the reps even say when they get a prospect on the phone. They care about stuff that's going to drive revenue, right? Reduce risk in some sort of way of them hitting their pipeline. So let's talk about when you think about like a typical deal, and we'll go through some of the common mistakes. Look at all this different stuff that people sell here.
Wow.
It's pretty crazy, yeah.
Awesome.
In a typical deal for you, are you starting below the line with the people that you're talking to? Are you starting above the line? Like, when does the business value, when do you start to have some of those conversations? And maybe kind of walk us through, feel free to get as tactical as you'd like how you kind of approach that conversation.
I think I'm actually going all over the line. I'm above, I'm below.
Yeah.
Fortunately, with my product, it's easier for me to cast a wider net to do that. I think the level of research I'm doing prior to prospecting and reaching out is going to be different for a VP than it would be maybe a frontline manager. But if I'm reaching out to a public company, I'm looking at earnings transcripts. I'm trying to see like what top line initiatives they're really focused on, and then leveraging those in my initial outreach. And then on those discovery calls, if it's with an executive, my first line a lot of the time is, look, I'm sure you get cold called a lot or emailed a lot. Like, why'd you join this one in particular? Like, what's going on? Because usually there's a specific reason why they joined, to try to help understand what's going on in their business. If I don't have a ton of background from the research I've done, often also I'm trying to reach below the line to collect information about the business and about their current, operations, so that when I do reach out above the line in a prospecting motion, I've got a much more targeted pitch that I can leverage versus a more generic one about how we're, helping people drive more pipeline. Yeah.
Okay. So again, just because there's a lot of new folks hopping on, what we're kind of deconstructing here is, Avi had a killer year last year, 162% of quota, and you're doing pretty good this year. I know you just got off a really great quota last time or quarter, last time we talked. So we're kind of deconstructing this. I think one of the first big things, it sounds like, to your approach is, and if I had to call this a common mistake, would be speaking to an executive, someone above the line, VP or above, and then not having good intel. And you almost overdo the discovery, where you're asking all of these basic questions that a sales manager, in your case, on their team might be able to answer some research, and you basically waste this opportunity. Can you tell us a little bit more about this approach of like this intel gathering approach and sort of what that plays into your sales approach and your success?
I try to build decks actually with my champion or coach prior to meeting with the executives that are talking about, the specific challenges with the before, scenario and the goals they're trying to achieve after the fact. And then the first thing I'm really trying to do is confirm if I got this right or wrong. I usually frame it in a no-oriented way. Did I get this wrong? And if the executive says no, it's like, so then I'm trying to understand specifically how they are, how they're thinking about solving these problems. And trying to understand what the impact could be if they do address these problems with something like Orem or Sisense or anybody else.
So Olivier in the chat was asking, hey, interesting to understand how you get enterprise operators to give you info. Here often get blocked because they don't want to give sensitive info. Do you have some tactical things that you could share around, hey, if you decide to pick up the phone and call someone at the IC, the individual contributor or manager level to do some intel gathering, how does that approach work? What's maybe some of the language that you use? Like, how do you get these people willing to open up and share information so that when you do approach that executive, you have some good intel?
So one is a mindset thing. So for me, I know
Mhm.
that, half the time I'm gonna get hung up on or shut down if I'm cold calling and asking an IC for information. So it's just accepting the fact that just because one person isn't going to give me information doesn't mean the next person won't, right? So just keep going and keep trying to get that information. Tactically though, when I ask questions, I try to make it as casual as possible. So an example would be if I'm calling someone and they say, oh, we're using a competitor, instead of saying and responding like, hey, would you mind sharing who you guys are currently using? Which is kind of like a formal way of asking. I'm like, oh, who are you guys using? Try to make it more like of a casual ask versus trying to like make it seem like it's a big request that you're making to collect
Yeah.
information. Hope that's helpful.
Yeah. Let's talk about that a little bit. I don't want to gloss over that because that's like the art, I feel like part of selling is just being like an easy, chill person to talk to that I feel comfortable sharing information with. Can you tell us a little bit more about when you think of these, they almost, we could almost use the word invasive to describe some of these questions because they're so personal in nature. Is there anything else around your tonality, how you phrase the question, anything like that? Because this is where I feel like a lot of reps that I see struggles. They want to extract this kind of sensitive information. And it's like all like the way that they're asking it is the turnoff, not the question necessarily that they're asking.
Yeah, I think tone is so important. The way that you get a good tone when you're doing this is by practicing it. And I think a lot of
Mhm.
times you're going to get the same objections, whether it's about scheduling a disco meeting or collecting information. You're going to get the same rebuttals
Yeah.
90% of the time. The key is to practice what they are. Like, so if it's, oh, I'm not the right person for that, having a tried and true repeatable message that you do every single time. So for me, it's like, hey, I know it's not your job to help lost sales guys like me, but any thoughts on who I should be reaching out to, right? Or if they're talking about
Yeah.
like, oh, I got to talk to my boss. It's not, well, do you mind sharing who your boss is? Oh, who do you roll up to? What's their
Yeah.
name? Just casual, try to make it as casual as you possibly can. Because that you're
You're
lowering their guard, right? You're lowering their guard. The
yeah.
more formal and awkward it feels, the more likely it is their guard's going to go up and they're not going to want to share anything because they don't know who you are.
Yeah. So removing the formality and the way that you're speaking almost sounds like how you would speak to another rep at Orem or maybe not another rep, maybe it's someone else in a different department that you're trying to figure out who to get something that you need from. Yeah, it's very informal. You're not you don't have your sales hat on, so to speak, in a bad way. Um, okay. So one more question on this piece before we move on. The intel gathering from the below the line prospect, are you doing this throughout the sales cycle too? So let's say that you got a call coming up where some executives are going to be brought into a second or third call. Are you doing any kind of calling around, working with your champion? Like, what are you doing to prepare for that call so that when you come in and speak with the executive, it's like, hey, here's what I've learned and let me catch you up versus speaking with them for the first time and doing all this discovery that they're frankly going to get really annoyed with pretty quickly.
Yeah, I think the key to any information gathering below the line is figuring out what the personal win for that person is going to be. So
Yeah.
why do they want you to have a good meeting with their executives? Because if you can
Mhm.
articulate why it's going to benefit them specifically for you to have a great call for an initiative to begin, you're going to be much more willing to share that information. I'm absolutely pretty much on every single touch trying to collect direct dial information. So cell phone if I can, and getting on a texting basis with as many people as I possibly can at every organization I'm selling into. I find that it's a good barometer for how good your deal is. If everybody's
Yeah.
telling you, no, you can't have my cell phone, that's a red flag that you probably don't have good relationships with anyone there. I think the call between the call is huge, right? The not recorded call with a coach, with a champion, digging into the business pain to really help frame that executive level conversation. So short answer, yes, absolutely. Meeting with as many people as possible.
Got it. Okay. Let me know in the chat for those of you watching. Um, do you text prospects throughout the sales cycle? Let us know in the chat. Give us a yes or a no. And I want to ask you about this because this is so clutch to be able to do this. Kyle says no in all caps. So a lot of no's. Okay. I think how you do this is super important. So do you get the opt-in? Do you ask them to text? Do you text them without asking? At what point do you text? How do you do that? How do you approach it?
Always opt in. I'm never cold texting or anything like
Yep.
that. I think that's a big no-no. For me, other people have different workflows. Usually at the end of the discovery call, I'll get it. If it's been a good conversation and I feel like there's interest in, moving to some kind of next step, it's what's your cell? Or, hey, I'm looking at outreach. We use outreach. Like, hey, is your cell phone XYZ? And just listing it out. They say, yeah. Or they correct me and tell me I'm wrong and they give it to me. It's like, cool, I'll shoot you a quick text right now. So you've got my info and then, look forward to next steps or whatever it is. That's kind of the ending of the call. It's sort of assumptively getting on that texting basis. Sometimes they'll say, nah, I prefer not to go with text. And okay, cool. No worries. Forget I asked. You can't make it awkward if they say no. That's the, that's the key,
Yeah.
is not making it awkward. So
Yeah.
I also primarily do it, by the way, when it's a one-on-one call. It's a little bit weird if you've got a bunch of people on a call and you ask one person for their cell phone, and then if they turn you down, then it's a really awkward situation. So I usually just wait for those one-on-ones. Another situation where there's multiple people on, like if I've met with you and your boss is coming to the next call, and on the first call, I got your cell phone, so they know I do that already. On the second call, I'll ask the boss for their cell phone because I'm already on a texting basis with you.
Yeah. So the texting, and for those of you that are maybe not quite sold on texting, you guys, it's so money because if we got a big call coming up tomorrow, I could shoot you a text and say, hey, Avi, I had a question real quick. I know you're inviting David and Katie into the next call. I had a couple ideas I want to run by you. You got 10 minutes, 15 minutes, maybe later today too. Like you can do little stuff like that is just so hard to do through email. And the responsiveness, SalesLoft did a bunch of studies on this. I think what they found was that the response time to deals in cycle from prospects is like 30 to 60 minutes through text versus like up to 24 hours to an email. So the responsiveness and the reply rate is just so much higher. So what I heard there is definitely get the opt-in, do it early. And then whenever you need intel or need to prep before another call, like that's the time that you're using text.
Yeah, it's not, and usually I'm not calling them to try to just like chat real quick. It's, hey, do you have 5 minutes? Shoot them a quick text. They say, yeah, then I'm calling them. So it's a more, it's more casual, right? It's not as serious every time we're meeting. I think also I'm selling to sales and marketing personas. So maybe it's different for me. I think if you're selling to a persona where you feel like maybe texting isn't the right route, I would encourage you to just try and ask a few times, because the worst thing they say is no, right? If they say yes, you've got their cell phone number, you can text them and you're good to go.
When I work with reps on this and in personal experience, I find that hardly any prospect, if you do this right, is resistant to being text. They would almost prefer to get a text rather than an email. And like you said before, it's a good way to pressure test the deal. Okay, so let's keep rolling. I think we answered. You guys are asking some questions, some great questions in the chat. Please make sure to put those into the Q&A, and it'll kind of separate it from the chat so I can find them. Let's talk about. We'll go a little bit out of order right now, but champion building and multi-threading, because I think this is a good segue. So in that first call, how are you thinking about champion building? Let's talk about that one first. Is there a process or steps that you go through when you're thinking about, okay, I need to really build a good champion here, or to figure out if this person could be a good champion? What are some of the ways that you approach that?
Yeah, I think it's really about identifying if they could even be a champion before I build them into one. It's one of those things that comes with time. It's something I'm actually working on myself. I'm not, perfect either. So I definitely have room to improve. I think, look, when I'm having these conversations and I'm asking about the challenges that the company's facing and how they're hoping to help, or how we can maybe help. I mentioned before, like below the line is, calling, time spent calling, stuff like that. Whereas above the line is pipeline, revenue, customer acquisition costs, things of that nature. So I asked them about the challenges and they describe call volume. A red flag is triggered. When they start talking about revenue or pipeline targets, that makes me feel better about them being a potential champion. If they're going down the route of maybe this person isn't a champion, then I'm asking them about revenue goals, pipeline goals. If they don't know, that's a red flag. At which point it's identifying like what the personal win is for that person and why it behooves them to introduce me to their boss, who could be the champion. That person may not even be the champion above them, right? So it goes from uncovering that they're not the champion to figuring out a way to sell this as their personal win. Why does it make sense, Jason, for you to loop in your boss on the next call?
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to write some of this stuff down for everyone. Okay. So this would be like mistake number 3. And here's what we have so far for everyone. Mistake number 3 is the inability to identify a good champion and also identify their personal win, right? So let's talk about, do you guys use Medic?
Yeah.
Or anything like that? So can you talk about what's the difference between a coach and a champion? Because I think there's a massive confusion between like what a champion actually is. And you started alluding to some of this, but in your mind, what's the difference between a champion versus someone that can just provide helpful intel to you?
I think it's really their level of influence at its core. In both situations, like a coach and a champion, they both are advocating for your product. The champion is the one that can actually move the needle with the person that is signing the check. And to really simplify it, right? It's funny. Yep. I was out to dinner with the sales team, and we have a product that we're piloting that I really want, and I was positioning it to our VP. Hey, we should really get this product. And he turns to one of the other directors and starts asking their opinion. And it was in that moment that I realized I was a coach, not a champion for this deal. So that was,
it's so meta.
Yeah, that was a learning moment for me. But no, I think seriously though, the real difference is that champion can actually get it done within the organization and has a direct line to the person that's signing, hopefully is the person that's signing.
Okay, so Ashley Black asked a couple good questions that we can get to. You sort of answered the first one. How do you build your champion? How are you thinking about this from a rapport standpoint, if at all? If that even is part of the champion building conversation at all? How do you build like the actual relationship, I guess, where they feel like, okay, Avi's on my side? You mentioned the personal win, and feel free, I don't know if there's specific questions that you ask or things that you say, but how do you get the person to really feel like, hey, I'm on your side? And how do you get them comfortable?
It takes time, both in the relationship with the individual as well as in the role. What I mean by that is I'm not going to have a ton of rapport with the person after the first discovery call, but it's after a few of those text exchanges, maybe a couple ad hoc meetings that we've had a chance to just chat about things, just life in general, not necessarily the deal in and of itself, that you begin to build more of a relationship. But when I talk about time in the role, you need to come off as an expert. Like if your coach or your champion is going to introduce you to the next person up, they need to feel confident you're not going to embarrass them. And the way that they feel confident you're not going to embarrass them is if you express a serious level of business acumen, understanding of what their challenges are and how you're going to really help them. I think those are 2 really critical elements for building that rapport and getting access to the real DMs.
Yeah. So let's then kind of segue this into multi-threading, because these really go hand in hand. I think you mentioned something really important I don't want to gloss over. Like if someone's reluctant to introduce you to power, it's usually for a couple of reasons, right? One could be because they don't have a lot of influence, right? Another, from what I heard for you though, is, they may not be confident that, inviting these folks into the next conversation is going to be a good use of their time. Whether because they don't trust you, lack of business acumen might make them look bad, whatever it might be. So let's talk about multi-threading. How are you approaching and thinking about multi-threading? And I know there's a lot of different situations that can come up and there's a lot of nuance to it, but how are you thinking about that? What does good look like?
I think I definitely am trying to loop in my leadership on my side and have them try to create some kind of relationship with leadership on the other side. In an ideal world, I'm getting the intros, we're doing the exec alignment, everyone's on the same page and pushing forward to a goal. A lot of other times I don't have that buy-in from the coach, because that's what they are, to actually loop in other people. And I'm ghostwriting an email for my VP and having them send it over just kind of as an introductory, reaching out basically to say hello and share that we're working on a project together, to kind of put a face to the name, right? Or a name to the inbox. Chris Orlob does a really good job talking about access to power and how you can set social contracts with coaches and champions about your intentions and ways to frame, the objections that you get to access to higher up folks. He does a really good training on YouTube. I think it is definitely like that.
So, okay. So in that first call, are you doing anything prior to that first call from a multi-threading standpoint? Are you looking at, hey, I'm going to be meeting with Avi. Looks like his CRO is so-and-so, VP of sales. I know I'm going to need to get looped in. Are you doing any of that kind of research in advance of that first call so that you kind of know who to ask for or who to recommend that they loop in?
Definitely. Looking at the call, like looking at LinkedIn and seeing who's who in the zoo. And I'm not having my exec reach out or VP or anybody reach out to any of their execs prior to a discovery call. But it's good to try to map out the organization as best you can, so that when you are proposing next steps, you're not saying, hey, why don't we get on a call with your boss? It's like, let's get a call on with Jason. We can talk about this as well. It just it makes it, I think it's just stronger. It's a stronger way to ask.
Yeah. Let me know in the chat. And again, the reason I ask this is I find that a lot of people don't do this, but let us know in the chat, yes or no. Do you do stakeholder research prior to that first call so that you can then suggest specific people by name during that first sales call? Let us know in the chat, yes or no.
What I do sometimes, which is fun also, is if it's a really big opportunity and it's not a normal one, it's a larger scale opportunity, I'll go on LinkedIn and get pictures of the execs and put them on a slide with all the names. So who I think the EB is, who's going to be a significant influencer, who's going to be tied to technical and financial sign off. And then if the person is a true coach or champion, they're going to tell me where I'm wrong and where I'm right, or let me know about people that I haven't thought of. So I'm trying to absolutely make it as real as possible for them. Yeah.
And you're showing that slide on the first call?
If it went really well, yeah. Normally it's the second call.
Yeah. Though. Okay. That's another pro tip. I learned, I don't know who you got that from. I learned it from Armand. I saw him write a post about it one time, Armand Farouk. And I was like, oh, that's genius, dude. Every time I share that slide, people are like, oh, wow.
Yeah. I don't think it was Armand for me, but I can't remember who it was. But it wasn't my idea. I just stole it from somebody. So.
Okay. So research in advance who you think the stakeholders are going to be so you can ask by name. If you're not doing that, that's a huge pro tip. That makes it so much easier when you can say, hey, so I suggest that we get so-and-so and so-and-so looped in. That's usually how, when we're working with organizations like yours, we can get a really good outcome on XYZ, right? Okay, so during the actual call, when do you start to bring up other people? How do you think about when to bring it up? How do you do that part? Because I think this is the other part where reps oftentimes get stuck. And someone alluded to this into the chat. It was Mike Morrill said, what do you do when your champion wants everything to go through them? Do you still multi-thread? Whether that person's a champion or not is kind of a different part of that. But how do you think about multi-threading during that actual first call? When do you bring it up? How do you bring it up? That kind of thing.
I think the basic requirement is that they're excited about the opportunity, the prospect. If they don't really care about it, I'm not asking to multi-thread and gain access to other people. I don't know if that needed to be said, but I just want to clarify that. So I'm waiting for some kind of feedback that this is a significant improvement upon their current workflows that would drive a significant business outcome for them. Once I have that understanding, I'm not necessarily asking for them to loop in their boss because I don't think they can get the job done. It's like, hey, look, I've run this cycle a bunch of times. Based on my experience, it feels like somebody like XYZ are going to need to be involved in order to move this to the next step so you can get the outcome that you're looking for, increase pipeline, whatever it's going to be. Would you be opposed to, get on a call with them? Can we put some time on maybe tomorrow or Thursday? And to Mike's question, yeah, if everything needs to go through them, it doesn't feel like a champion to me. It feels like somebody that's probably trying to kind of keep you blocked and, contained. And typically what I'll do is just call around, because the deal's probably not going very far if they're keeping you in their own little bubble. Unless it's the
Yeah, I
CEO,
mean,
right? Then it's a different story. But if they're a
yeah.
frontline manager and they're doing that, then it's probably not going very far.
Oh, it's so annoying too. Because you think about how decisions are made at companies when they buy large purchases. I mean, it's never a single person that makes that purchasing decision, you know?
Nope.
So there's there's a small detail there that you mentioned. Again, I want to make sure it doesn't get glossed over by the people watching. You and I think another version of this that I really like too is doing it through a customer story, where it's like, hey, Avi, we've had some really great outcomes from our training. You're talking about self-sourcing AEs, like getting AEs to self-source when we've worked with companies like Gong and Zoom and a few others. Do you mind if I share how we're able to get a really good outcome from the training? Everyone says yes every single time. And to kind of walk them through, hey, well, it's really important that we get so and so involved because they're going to have this unique perspective. And then we're going to need to get enablement and we need to do this and yada, yada, yada. Are those people X, Y, Z? And you just go through the people and it's like, you're selling them on the outcome of the solution versus trying to sell them on getting other people involved so you can close the deal faster. So you get them to almost kind of look past the sale. And I see you nodding a bunch. Is that sort of the thinking here? Is like, we're multi-threading because this helps de-risk like the outcome that you're going to get from the software if you choose to purchase it. Because McKinsey's got a stat, I think it's like 71% of change management initiatives fail. So like most implementations don't go well with software. So is my thinking kind of right there?
Couldn't have said it better myself. Yeah. I mean, I think it's really about framing every ask for increased access in the way that benefits the prospect, not you. It's not about closing my deal faster. It's about getting you this software that's going to help you achieve the outcome you need to achieve so you can get promoted, so you can hit accelerators, whatever it is. Like, what's their personal win and why does looping in more people assist or aid in that personal win? It's all that matters.
Love it. Okay, so let's keep moving. So far we got 4 mistakes to avoid here. Dropped them into the chat. I want to talk about bad deals. So one of the things that you talked about that I'm really big on too is, not like spending too much time on bad deals and not having like a really good way to identify early red flags so that you can DQ bad deals early. How do you think about this?
Well, my favorite quote is one I stole from John Barrett at Sisense, one of my old directors, is that there's 2 winners in every deal. There's the rep that wins and the rep that gets out first. And so I'm always trying to disqualify a deal if I can. I think a lot of people hold on to their bad deals because they don't have enough pipeline and they're scared to get rid of a deal. When in reality, working a bad deal just takes away from your time to work the good deals and hit your number. So I think it's a mentality shift that a lot of people struggle with. And I think at its core, it's from a lack of pipeline.
Yeah. It's like a fat pipeline cures all. Like it even comes out in your tonality when you're selling too, when you're less desperate. And it's like people always talk about having an abundance mentality. I'm like, what's the easiest thing to do is just to have actual abundance, whether it's in your life or in your sales pipeline. In this case, just have the abundance, and then you will have an abundant mindset. Like they go hand in hand for sure. Are there specific things that if you're thinking about good and bad deals, are there specific red flags that you look for so that other people can kind of be thinking about, hey, if I see this thing or experience this thing, I know that, hey, I'm not going to spend a lot of time pursuing this deal because that time could be spent somewhere else. Is there anything specific for you that you look for?
Well, it touches on what we were talking about earlier about, coach versus champion. If this person is willing to introduce me to other folks, it's somebody that maybe I'm willing to spend a lot more time nurturing and building up. So a red flag often for me is that they're not willing to loop their boss in. They're flaky about they're wishy-washy about next steps. Like we don't have anything on the calendar. Those are some indicators. I also try to ask early and often about budget and funding for the project, assuming that there's a value that they're interested in, getting. So questions like, how are you thinking about funding this project on like a second call, so that I can try to understand, like, is there allocated budget? Is this, not something that's been budgeted? And if so, okay, well, what's the last time unbudgeted spend was approved? Can you tell me about that? So like doing that champion testing as well. Those are typically the red flags. So not looping in other people, lack of any understanding of around the budgeting process or decision-making process, that kind of thing. As well as, sorry, I keep going. It's, the enablement I've gotten from my leadership team and from other reps, like what are indicators in a deal that make it more likely to close? Which CRM are they using, right? Just the kind of the basics of qualification that you would need to do for your own individual product. And if they don't check the boxes, then don't chase them.
Yeah. Is deal size at all something that you look at, or has that already been kind of predetermined through your account selection?
What do you mean? Sorry.
So like, for example, for me, in all candor, if it's a team with 100+ reps and it's a cool logo, I'm much more likely to spend time on that deal if things are not quite going the way that I want versus a company that has less than 10 reps. Where I'm like, it just doesn't make sense to over pursue this. Is there anything like that you look for that's maybe like deal size or potential or number of seats or anything like that helps you determine this is where I'm going to spend a lot of time, or you know what, I'm just going to let them come to me. If they come back, awesome, like we'll take the business, but I'm not going to like work really hard for it.
Definitely. That's an element to this as well. I mean, if it's a really big deal, maybe I'd be willing to overlook a red flag or two. It doesn't mean I'm going to hide from it. I'm going to call it out early and often. But yeah, I think most reps would agree that, if it's a bigger deal, you're definitely willing to put a lot more effort into it than if it's a small, 1-seat deal, 2-seat deal, something like that.
So how do you, because this is something that we talked about too, being afraid to challenge prospects was a common mistake that you had mentioned. So how do you talk about these red flags? Like, how do you bring it up? All of that kind of stuff.
Well, I think, so one example of a red flag is when people tell me, and this is for my particular sale, why don't we do a pilot and we'll use that to build a business case and use that to get the budget. Right? Sounds great. Can you tell me about the last time you did that? Has that worked before? And what's different about this project that makes, you feel like it's a way to go about it? It's kind of like just questioning and being curious about their logic, their thinking. Yeah. Tell me about the last time you.
Yeah. I love that. It's like, and that applies to a lot of different stuff. Tell me about the last time you brought in a solution like this. Tell me about the last time you purchased something that you didn't have budget for. How did that work? And if you're not getting good answers, it's like, well, are you pretty upfront then at that point? You're just like, hey, I'm pretty worried at this point that like you have this goal, you have this thing that you want to accomplish, and I don't see like a clear path for us to help you get this done. Like, are you pretty direct about it?
Yeah, I think I also try to set the agenda and expectation at the beginning of the call that we're not for everyone. And if it's not a fit, it's not a fit, and that's okay. Like, I won't be offended. I don't want to waste their time. I don't want to waste my time, my team's time. So it's setting that expectation and understanding at the beginning of the call that, yes, I'm in sales, but you can tell me no, and that's going to be okay. Right. And so at the end, it's, look, based on if I'm reading the room right, it just doesn't feel like this is a project that's worth exploring right now. Am I misreading? Is that wrong? Is that crazy? They'll either say, no, that's not crazy, I think it's not a fit right now, or they'll overcome that and they'll tell me why it's actually something that they need, and they'll actually start selling for me, selling themselves on it. So it's like kind of being willing to pull away actually is a very strong sales tactic in a lot of situations.
Yeah, this is another huge pro tip, dude. Have you always been able to do that, or was that at some point something that was uncomfortable for you to like call out the elephant in the room? Because it's you're being very, maybe this is because you're from the East Coast too, dude. I love this about East Coasters, dude. They're so direct. Have you always been able to do that though in sales, or is that something you had to practice? Like, I'm asking that because this is something that it can be pretty tough, for a lot of people.
Definitely have not always been like this at all. My first, few years in sales, I would call the same people over and over and over and over again, even though they weren't a good fit, because I was scared to reach out to new people. I was scared to tell them no, that they weren't a fit. Like, I didn't have the abundance mentality. I was a hustler for sure. I worked hard. I made a lot of calls, but they weren't calls to the right people. I wasn't allocating my time well, really, at all. And I think, again, once you realize that time spent on bad deals is wasted time, and you're actually cutting into your ability to earn, once that happens, then you really start feeling less, I guess, anxiety around pushing back and pulling out of deals, because there's more in your, patch somewhere.
Yeah. Yeah, that's such a big thing. It's like you only have so much time in a week. And I think the mental energy and the mental drain of working bad deals is like, if you spent 2 hours a week, let's say, working bad deals, that drains more than 2 hours of energy. Like, it really depletes you from showing up where it really matters, and being able to say no, I think, is a big thing.
Also, too,
Okay.
not to derail your train of thought, but if you close a bad deal, they become a bad customer, and then they become like a drain on resources too. So it's very, very important not to chase bad deals, or foul balls, as we call it in Orem. Only chase the ones that are in play.
Yeah, no, totally, man. Okay. Michael Flynn asked a question. He said, I sell a highly technical product. The biggest objection I hear is we have this covered in house with our own team of data scientists. How would you overcome this objection? He said, for your tool, Orem, the objection may be framed as, oh, we're good. We do all of our dialing and sales loft. We're fine. Or a competitor objection. How do you think about that? And maybe if you could kind of preface that with, do you fish for that objection? Are you asking like other options that they might be looking into? Like, how do you think about this objection?
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say. Is if you're making cold calls or sending emails out, and more than 80% of the time they're doing something in house, you lead with that. Hey, look, I'm sure you're already doing something in house for this. You probably have a bunch of people that are that are on top of this already. The reason why I was reaching out, and then you explain your value prop, but also include a story, a customer story, somebody that did it all internally with their own data scientists, but then shifted to that buy model, build versus buy, right? They shift to that buy model, and what was the impact that it had for them. Again, you're not for everybody. So there's going to be some people that they do it all in-house. They've always done it in-house. It's just the way it's going to be, right? But I think if you lead with that, kind of like Eminem does in 8 Mile, right? Lead with all the things they could say.
Yeah.
I don't have anything else to say negatively to get out of it.
Yeah. There you go, Michael. It's a great answer. So that would be another mistake, is not fishing for objections early. Like, just calling out the elephant in the room. You know that if someone is looking into you, they're probably looking into someone else, or they're thinking about doing it themselves. So ask them about it. Get them talking about it. Do it early. Because the last thing, this used to happen to me early in my sales career, whereas like you figure out someone's looking into someone else, like at the very end of the sales cycle, when it's like too late, and there's already this narrative they've built internally around it that you just didn't get to shape at all. Okay. Ayad, probably mispronouncing his name, but he or she asked, how do you eliminate no-shows, especially if you have members of the team / boss invited to the call? So another thing I would add to that is, I notice there's like all kinds of little stuff with group calls. Like, when someone shows up late, you start early. If the boss doesn't show, what do you do? If your champion doesn't show up for whatever reason, like, what kind of situations do you come across in group calls? And also any general advice on how to run really good group calls, I think is good.
So I think there's 3 things there. It's like, how do you run a group call? How do you avoid no-shows? And what do you do if the person that you want to be there isn't there? Right. So how do you avoid no-shows? I think it's by getting an upfront verbal contract. So if I'm on a cold call and somebody tells me, that they're willing to book a meeting, it's like, all right, I'm going to send you an invite. You promise you're going to accept it. Okay, cool. So I'll see you then. See you that day, Thursday at 2:00. You promise you'll be there. Yeah, I'll be there. No problem. Great. So get them to tell you that they're going to be there. Follow up all the time if they haven't accepted the calendar invite. to make sure that it's on their calendar, they're ready to go. So that's how I typically avoid no-shows. When my champion or the EB or the DM, whatever acronym you want to use, if they're not on the call yet and there's somebody else that I haven't met yet, absolutely rapport building. What do you know about what we're talking about today? How does this impact you specifically? That kind of thing, to try to unearth anything you can from them and build another relationship. Take advantage of that time. Sometimes it's good when I'm on and there's my champion's not there yet. Someone new has jumped in. They're the first one on the Zoom. I'm accepting them. I'm letting my champion sit in the waiting room for a couple of minutes while I can keep figuring stuff out, and then letting the champion in, right? So I definitely I'm trying to do that. And then with group calls in general, I like to call on people specifically.
Yep.
So if I've got 5 people in the room, first off, I'm hopefully meeting with my champion in an ad hoc call or texting about who's who, what do they care about. So I'm kind of prepped in that, preparing questions for each of them, and then asking them specifically, right? Like what you don't want is for somebody just to be eating lunch and not really paying attention. They're just there so they don't get fined, right? Like, so when you ask them questions in particular, nobody else wants to get caught, flat-footed. And so then everybody starts paying attention when you start calling individuals out. You know what I mean? That's something I do. Thanks, Pamela.
There's almost like a power dynamic that gets leveled, because a lot of times as reps, we put ourselves in a position where we're lower on the power dynamic, and it's things that we do. We come in and we're not educated on the prospect, we're timid, whatever it might be. When you do stuff like that, it almost like does more than level the power dynamic, and almost like puts you in a place of power in the call where you're driving the call.
Yeah.
Just like I would when I'm running a training call with a big group of reps. Like, hey, I'm the person in charge here, and it's not an egotistical thing. It's just like, hey, that's how this call is going to go. I'm going to invite you to participate. We're going to have a good time together, but like, I'm going to come with the structure and drive this call and allow for participation. So the calling on people, that's a really fun one. Okay, I got another question for you. Okay. So Ashwin says, how do you deal with accounts with reasonable install but are not engaged despite multiple reach outs? And if I had to rephrase that, I think what he's kind of asking for is, like, what happens when a deal like loses momentum, or when they kind of go dark and for whatever reason you weren't able to schedule another call, or maybe they had to cancel the call? How do you re-engage stalled deals?
You pull away. Hey, I feel like this isn't a priority, which is totally fine. Am I misreading? Send the email out and let it go, because they're going to either correct you or not. They don't correct you, DQ it, on to the next. If they do correct you, then you're back in play, right? So it's like kind of a breakup email, but it's not like putting anything on them, for not responding or ghosting you. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, it's very simple. Another thing that I would add that I find works well too is just adding a sentence about why we were having the conversation. Hey, Avi, last time we talked, getting your AEs to self-source 30% plus of pipeline was critical to hitting the 2024 targets that you have next year. Is that no longer a priority? And like being very specific and pointing back. And I love this, like, sales is work, but buying is work also. And when you have a buyer that's unwilling to put in work, I don't want to spend a lot of time selling to those people, because they got to do work on their end too. There's stuff that has to happen outside of those calls. And it sounds like what you're pretty good at is finding the people that like are sold on changing and doing something different, but that are willing to put work in.
Yeah, you got to give them a little homework and test them, see if they'll do the homework or not. Because a lot of times, like if you ask them to collect, a list of users or a list of requirements and bring them to the next call, if they don't have them, it's a pretty bad sign for the next call. Pretty big red flag. We could have added that to the list of red flags from earlier, like not completing homework on time.
Yeah. So what kind of homework will you give buyers, just as an example?
Well, I think for me, it's understanding maybe what their current call volume is. If I'm talking to a lower level, like manager, usually those are the folks that I'm giving homework to try to build groundswell. So like calls people are making, reps that want to be looped into the pilot, scheduling meetings with sales ops or whomever to help with connections to their CRM. just like that kind of thing, or filling out MNDAs, right? If we need to do that, just in general, the paper, the boring stuff that like nobody wants to do, but we need to do to get a deal going.
Yeah. And it's pretty low effort stuff typically. You're not giving them hours of homework. You're saying, hey, dude, pull up a dashboard and like come with some of this information. So
Yep.
love that one. Michelle's got a great question. Keep the questions coming, you guys. These are good. So Michelle says, how to handle a DM who is a classic, you don't know what you don't know. The driver personality types that's like kind of expects you to know a lot, but they're also withholding info. So maybe another way of asking that would be like, how do you handle prospects, especially executives that come on and they don't really seem like they're willing to engage and play ball? How do you handle that?
I think it's about then getting their subordinates, assuming they're on the call, to talk about why this is a problem for them. So engaging with other people so they can understand why the organization is struggling with them. And then trying to ask, how they've considered fixing this, if they have considered fixing it in the past, like what have they tried? And then trying to get the EB to open up after you've gotten some of the lower level folks to open up about, what the impact could be for them specifically, or how they're thinking about the problem. There's some buyers that just aren't going to give you much. And at that point, it's kind of like you have to slowly work them and try to ask open-ended questions to try to get them in a spot where they'll open up to you. It's tough.
That's great advice.
It's tough though.
Well, it's like basically what you did there is you said, hey, this person's not opening up. I'm not going to work extra hard to sell this person. Let me get their team to help sell them on why this is important. There you go, Michelle.
You could also, before you ask the EB the question, put a disclaimer in the front of the question about why you're asking it, referencing a customer, like just creating some kind of relevance for why you're asking them that question, some reasoning behind it, and then ask the question. And then they're more likely to answer the question or acquiesce to your request, basically.
Yeah. Can you give an example of that? Because I think it's a great technique.
Well, it's like an example would be, so one thing we talk about as a way to fund Orem is by replacing future headcount spend. So instead of hiring 5 more people, maybe you allocate some resources to Orem to increase productivity. So how are you thinking about future headcount targets? The reason I ask is, and then XYZ company was able to achieve this kind of outcome and save this amount of money, right? So giving some kind of qualifier there, some reason behind the ask really increases psychologically their willingness to answer you.
Yeah. So I'm going to put this into the chat. Like, another pro tip that you dropped there, man, is like packing insights and customer stories into your questions.
Totally.
Like every executive, I interviewed Henry Schuck on our podcast, the CEO over at Zoom Info. And I asked him, I was like, hey, when you hop on a sales call, like when someone's selling something to Zoom Info, and it's such a big thing that they're selling that you get engaged in that deal. I was like, what do you want to get on those calls? He's like, I want to know what my best in class peers, if they're using their tool, like what they're doing. I want insights. That's what he wants. I want to know that someone that I respect is using your software or your solution. And I want to know like what they're doing, what's insightful, what's something that I can bring back to my team. And that's essentially what you're doing in those questions. It gives a reason to every question. Love that, dude. So let's, we got a couple more minutes. Let's just take a couple more questions. If you guys got a question, we'll try to get to as many as we can in the Q&A. Loving the engagement so far. Okay, Ashley Black. Ashley's been super engaged today. She asked, how do you handle change management objections, fears, holdups? So one thing I could imagine with Orem is they maybe haven't spent money on a dialer before, and they have sales engagement tools. And they're like, well, why do we need an extra thing? We're already spending all of this money on this data, these tools and all that kind of stuff. But how do you handle objections from people that they're just kind of worried about bringing new stuff in?
It's status quo, biggest competitor, right? Like doing what you're going to keep doing. And that's something that you really have to overcome. I think it's all about selling the future state of where they will go if they undergo this change. And also, depending on your resources that you've got at your company, explain to them what the post-sale process looks like and how you're going to assist them with that change. I don't know what specifically you're selling, Ashley, but I think it's really about making them feel like you're not just throwing the keys over the wall and saying good luck. You're going to help them instill that change. If you're doing a proof of concept or a proof of value, it's a great way also to help reduce that risk about people not actually using the tool and not adapting to the change.
Yeah. So talking about how you can kind of de-risk the implementation, so to speak, and then again, customer stories, man, is a
Yep.
really big thing with you. It sounds like. Let's see here. There you go, Ashley. So this is kind of an interesting one. Marilla asked, how would you sell a concept that isn't perceived well? For example, tech hardware rentals, but it has negative connotations. Rent a center. So if you sell a solution, so I think the equivalent for you might be if an organization maybe doesn't do a lot of cold calling. That may be a bad deal for you, actually. I don't know.
I wouldn't sell it to them. I would move on.
Yeah.
Like if it's not a fit and there's a negative perception, cool. We're not for everybody. Have a nice day.
Yeah. I think having that language too, I was just doing this in a deal I'm working yesterday where it's like, hey, just what I'm kind of hearing so far, this sounds like it's probably not going to be a good fit into your guys' wheelhouse. And I'm actually kind of worried that, based on the fact that your reps aren't doing a bunch of calls right now, that this might not be like the best tool for you guys. And then
Absolutely.
again, it's like, to your point, they start selling themselves or they agree with you. Either
Yep.
one is actually a great outcome.
100%. People don't want to be sold to. They don't want to feel like you're convincing them to do something else, right? So as soon as you start pulling away, they're either going to chase after you or they're going to let you go. And either case is great.
Yeah. No, totally, dude. Well, hey, we're out of time. I'm going to drop some links into the chat for you. Go make sure to check out Orem. We have a free objection handling course that we just launched with the Sell Better crew as well. A link in there, and then also make sure to connect with me and Avi on LinkedIn as well. But Avi, dude, good having you on, man. Ton of great tips. I love all of the mistakes, and always a fun time jamming with you, man, to learn from you and everyone else. Appreciate the engagement, the questions, and all that kind of stuff. And that's all we got, you guys. We'll see ya. Thank you, everyone. Have a good
Thanks,
one.
everyone.
Yeah, later.